Taiwan is one of the most dangerous places on the earth right now. Chinese fighter jets fly near its airspace almost every day. Warships circle its waters, and missiles have been soared above the island. And yet, life goes on as if nothing is happening. People wake up early, squeeze onto crowded trains, the streets fill with scooters weaving in between cars. Night markets glow, and the smell of sizzling street food fills the air. They vote in free elections, choosing their own leader, and they build the tiny chips that power the modern world. Millions of people go about their daily lives, even with that tension hanging in the air, which is what makes the situation so difficult to fully grasp. This place is Taiwan. China sees Taiwan as a breakaway province, a part of its territory that must eventually be reunified. Taiwan sees itself very differently, as its own society, with its own government and its own future, which makes us feel less like a simple political dispute and more like two completely different realities colliding. And if either side pushes too far, this can become a conflict that pulls in the United States and risk escalating into a war between major world powers. So, how did we get here? To understand that, we have to go back. Taiwan didn't begin as Chinese as the way we think of it today. For thousands of years, the island was home to indigenous Austronesian people, more closely related to the cultures of the Philippines and Pacific Islands than mainland China, which already challenges the idea that Taiwan has always simply been a part of China. But Chinese settlers began arriving in larger numbers in the 1600s during the Qing dynasty. They crossed the Taiwan Strait in small boats to farm, trade, and build new lives. But even then, the island felt distant, far from the center of power, loosely governed, and often ignored. One Chinese official once described it as a place beyond the reach of civilization, which is striking considering that today it sits at the center of one of the most important geopolitical tensions in the world. Then, in 1895, everything changed. After losing the First Sino-Japanese War, China was forced to hand Taiwan over to Japan. And just like that, Taiwan's path split from China's and would never fully be reconnected again. For the next 50 years, Taiwan was ruled by Japan. Railways were built across the island, ports expanded, cities modernized, public health improved, and education systems were introduced. And by the 1930s, Taiwan was one of the most developed places in Asia. But it came at a cost. Not freedom, but control. Rebellions were crushed, cultures were suppressed, and in 1930, indigenous fighters rose up against Japanese rule and were violently put down. Still, something deeper was happening. In 50 years, Taiwan developed outside of China, with different systems and different experiences, which made its path increasingly separate rather than shared. And slowly, a different identity was formed. In 1945, Japan lost World War II. Taiwan was handed back to China. And at first, people celebrated, but this optimism didn't last. The new government was corrupt, inefficient, and disconnected from the people. Tensions grew quickly, and in 1947, everything broke. A protest turned violent, troops were sent in, and they opened fire on civilians, turning a protest into a massacre, and one that would be remembered for generations. Over the next following weeks, thousands were killed. This became known as the 228 incident, and it left a deep scar, because now, for many in Taiwan, rule from China didn't feel like unity, it felt like control, which helps explain why trust between Taiwan and the mainland never fully recovered. At the same time, China itself was collapsing into civil war, communist versus the nationalist. And in 1949, the communists won. They took control of the mainland, creating the People's Republic of China, and the nationalist government fled, not to another country, but all to Taiwan. Around 1 million people from all over the country crossed the sea, bringing their government with them. And now, there are two governments, both claiming to be the real China, one in Beijing and one in Taiwan. And the war never officially ended, which means the situation today isn't new, but part of something that has remained unresolved for decades. At first, much of the world sided with Taiwan. The United States recognized it as the real China. Taiwan held China's seat at the United Nations, and it had military protection from the US. But in 1970, that changed. The US wanted to build better relations with mainland China, so in 1971, the UN gave China's seat to Beijing. And in 1979, the US officially switched recognition, and Taiwan was no longer seen as a country by most of the world. And yet, it still existed, still governed itself, still operated independently, so it became something unusual. Not fully recognized, but not controlled either. A country, without being called one, which is unusual because in practice, it functions like a country in almost every way. Back in Taiwan, the government tightened its grip. Martial law was declared. Oppositions were silenced. During what became known as the White Terror, where tens of thousands were imprisoned and thousands more were executed. Even speaking out could be dangerous. Taiwan wasn't free, but it was stable. And at the same time, something else was happening. Starting in the 1960s, Taiwan's economy began to grow rapidly. Small factories expanded into global exporters. Textiles turned into electronics. Basic manufacturing turned into advanced industries. And by the 1980s, Taiwan was producing goods used all across the world. And eventually, it became the center of something even bigger: semiconductors. The tiny chips that power the modern life. Companies like TSMC would go on to produce the majority of the world's most advanced chips. Phones, computers, cars, and even military systems, all depending on Taiwan, often without even realizing, which makes this island not just politically sensitive, but economically critical to the entire world. And with that growth came something else. Education expanded, a middle class emerged, and with it, demands for political freedom. In the late 1980s, change finally came. Martial law was finally lifted, and opposition parties were legalized. And in 1996, Taiwan held its first direct presidential election, peacefully, something that set it apart in a region where that was far from guaranteed. Taiwan became one of Asia's most important democracies. And at that moment, the divide between Taiwan and China became more than just political. It became ideological. One system authoritarian, the other democratic. And that made reunification far more complicated, because it was no longer just about territory, but about fundamentally different systems and ways of life. Today, China has made its position clear. Taiwan must eventually be reunified by force, if necessary. And the pressure is growing. Chinese fighter jets now enter Taiwan's air zone on a regular basis. In 2022, after a high-level U.S. visit, China launched massive military drills all around the island. Missiles were fired all above Taiwan for the first time, and warships surrounded it. These aren't random actions. They're signals, warnings, which makes the situation feel less distant and more like something that can actually realistically escalate. And at the same time, the United States continues to support Taiwan, sending weapons and maintaining a military presence nearby. But it stops short of fully recognizing it. This balancing act is called strategic ambiguity, and it's meant to prevent war while preparing for the possibility of one, which creates a constant tension without ever fully resolving the situation. Taiwan is not just an island. It's the result over a century of separation, colonization, war, dictatorship, economic transformation, and democracy, all shaping something distinct. Today, China looks at Taiwan and sees unfinished history. Taiwan looks at itself and sees a separate future apart from China. And the world is caught in between, which makes this more than just a regional issue, but something with global consequences. This is why tensions run so high, because each side wants very different things, and neither is willing to back down, with a conflict rooted not just in land, but in identity, history, and competing visions of the future. Every military exercise, every missile test, every diplomatic move carries the risk of spiraling out of control. And if it does, the consequences can pull on the world's superpowers. Taiwan may just be an island, but the conflict over it has the power to change the course of history, which is what makes the situation feel so uneasy, because nothing has happened yet, but everything feels like it could. And right now, the story isn't finished.